I'm from Mississippi, and on the 4th of July, my son's best friend came with us to my family's get-together, and their friend is black, and he was the only black person. My son's friend was obviously going to be protected with us, as are all of our black friends, because I'm very aware of how racist people can be in Mississippi. And I even told my kids before we left for my family's 4th of July thing that if anyone said anything racist, that they knew that their mama was going to speak up, say something, because I don't care who you are. I don't care if you're my own family. I'm going to call you out on your racist BS, and that we would immediately leave, because I'm not going to tolerate that ever. So my kids know that about me, but I also want to make sure that they know that we have to speak out no matter who it is. I don't care if it's family. People come out and are saying, you need to warn your kids about being the only black person amongst a group of white people, especially in certain places around here. Very much so. I agree with it. I'm always telling my kids, if you are with your friends who aren't white and you're around any certain area and someone comes out saying racist stuff, you have to be the one that speaks up. You have to intervene. When my kids were little and they would go play basketball at another guy's house, his neighbor always hung a Confederate flag. And I would tell my boys, if y'all are set on playing basketball there at your friends, please know if that man ever comes outside of that house, you have to be the one to speak to him. Do not let your black friends try to say anything, because you never know what that man might do to them. So as a white parent who is very aware of the racism here and everywhere, in most places, unfortunately, it is my job to make sure I educate my children, simply not on being not racist, but I want to teach them, and I do teach them, how to be anti-racist and how to use the privilege that they have as a white person around here to make sure that they're the ones speaking up and intervening to protect all their friends who aren't white, because they're going to be viewed differently than their black friends. And so they have to do that. They have to step in. So if you're a white person and you get offended by people saying, don't let your black children be the only black person going somewhere with a white family, we should not be offended. We should be very aware of what they have to deal with all the time. And it doesn't matter if we're the exception to that rule. We should understand where they're coming from, and then also do our part to make sure we're educating our children on how to be better stewards of the privilege that they have, especially in these places, and to make sure that they're protecting their friends.
Bombshell tonight in the Nolan Wells investigation. A mystery altercation emerges. And not with the guys that took him to the island on the boat. Does this change things? We cannot ignore it.
A grieving mother is being told that she isn't grieving the right way. A group of teenagers who watched their friend disappear are now fundraising to defend themselves instead of simply mourning him. And two of the loudest voices in true crime, a former prosecutor and a former police officer, are now arguing with each other on camera instead of focusing on him. Somewhere beneath a month of heated arguments, a subpoena, and a lie detector rumor that refuses to disappear, an 18-year-old named Nolan Wells is still waiting for one thing: an answer. If you've been with us since our first video on this case, welcome back. You already know that we don't present speculation as fact here. If this is your first time finding us, stay with us for the next few minutes, because what we're about to walk through today didn't happen on Horn Island. It happened this week in front of cameras, between two adults who have never even met Nolan Wells, and it could end up mattering just as much as anything discovered in that water. Subscribe now, because we're about to break down a fight that the rest of the internet is either cheering on or completely ignoring. And neither response is the right one. Before we go one step further, here's where this case actually stands, stripped of everyone's opinions, including ours. Confirmed: Nolan Xavier Wells, 18 years old, a recent Ocean Springs High School graduate and an incoming wide receiver at Southwest Mississippi Community College, traveled to Horn Island off the Mississippi Gulf Coast on July 4, 2026, with a group of friends. He did not return with them. His mother, Christine Wansley, reported him missing that night. His body was recovered from the water near the island on July 6. Identification was made through dental records rather than visual confirmation. The Jackson County Sheriff's Office, the FBI, and the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources have all confirmed involvement in the investigation at various points. GPS data obtained by CBS News shows that the boat Nolan traveled on left a private dock at approximately 9:56 a.m., arrived at Horn Island at 11:14 a.m., and departed the island at 4:31 p.m. without Nolan on board. NBC News obtained audio through a public records request of a distress call reporting a mechanical failure on that boat that afternoon. The family has retained civil rights attorney Ben Crump, and the district attorney has told the family that a grand jury will eventually receive the case once the sheriff's investigation concludes. Disputed whether Nolan chose to stay behind voluntarily or was somehow left behind, what the altercation heard in a widely circulated video actually was whose voice is on that recording, whether a separate confrontation occurred on the island after the boat left at 4:31 p.m., and what, if anything, the deleted Snapchat activity on his phone actually means. Unknown, the official cause and manner of death, toxicology results from either the state's autopsy or the independent examination commissioned by the family, whether criminal charges will ultimately be filed, and if they are, who those charges might involve. Everything in this video, the fight between Nancy Grace and Officer Tatum, the friends' fundraising, the claims about an apology, all of it sits on top of that unresolved foundation. None of it changes what has been confirmed. None of it fills in what remains unknown. Keep that in the back of your mind, because much of the coverage currently circulating about this case is not nearly as clear as those facts.
If people are sending in videos, they should be using those videos to conduct further investigation.
There is a group of people fighting at 5 p.m. Who are they? Where was he? He wasn't floating in the water. He wasn't on the shore. Tonight, evidence of a so-called mystery altercation is emerging. Straight out to Crime Stories investigative reporter Dave Mack. Dave, what can you tell me first about this so-called mystery altercation? And this is not with the men that went to Horn Island on the boat. You know what? Let me just be clear. Crime Stories is not a symposium, a gathering place for a witch hunt. We want the truth about what happened to Nolan Wells. We are here to convict no one yet. And if evidence of a mystery altercation with other young men arises, we are pursuing it. Dave Mack, what do we know about some mystery altercation? We think after the Triton left Horn Island.
Nancy, this is a mystery altercation that is being described through social media as something that took place around 5 p.m. that day. This is 30 minutes after the Triton already left. And in this particular account, a Bertram boat was seen leaving shortly afterward at a high rate of speed. Now, this social media conversation claims that a person, one of the passengers, pretty certain Nolan Wells, was part of a group that was, quote, almost fighting around 5 p.m.
Bip, 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 bip. Whoa, wait. Hold on, Nellie. Did you say 5 p.m.?
Yes.
Okay. The reason I jumped in, Dave Mack, is because 5 p.m., if Nolan was seen in an altercation at 5 p.m. on Horn Island, that's after the Triton, had already left. Let's see the boat, control room. We're talking about the boat leaving Horn Island. That boat. Had that boat already left when this altercation occurred? Dave Mack, that's a yes, no.
Yes.
Listen.
But the person said in the DM to another kid that is associated, not any of the kids that I interviewed to talk to, but that could be associated to some degree, that knew Nolan, that this person wrote a message saying me and my husband saw you arguing with Nolan, and to the effect of you're going to spend the rest of your life in prison. Nolan and another person that he may have been in an argument with, to me, are people that need to be investigated.
Here's something worth thinking about before we go any further. Just 1 month ago, almost nobody outside Ocean Springs, Mississippi, had even heard the name Nolan Wells. Today, two national media figures with millions of combined followers are involved in an ongoing public dispute over how this case should be covered. That has now become a story of its own, sitting on top of the original case, and it deserves to be examined separately rather than blended into Nolan's disappearance itself. Nancy Grace built her career, and later her media platform, around strongly advocating for victims and their families, often before every fact has been established. That approach has earned her loyal audiences for decades, along with long-standing criticism in equal measure. This case has been no different. Brandon Tatum, known online as Officer Tatum, previously worked as a police officer before becoming a full-time commentator. He has built a following in part by challenging what he considers premature conclusions in high-profile cases. The Nolan Wells case has very much become one of those cases. Over the past several weeks, the two have repeatedly clashed in public over the Nolan Wells case. Not over whether either of them believes someone is guilty, because nobody has been charged with anything, but over how the story is being presented while everyone waits for actual answers. Grace has repeatedly focused on several specific questions. Why would an 18-year-old who, by every account, was as attached to his phone as most people his age are, leave that phone behind on a boat if he had genuinely decided to remain on the island? What does it mean that the Snapchat activity from that day was deleted? And why did it apparently take investigators as long as it did to bring in federal resources and approach the case with the urgency her audience expected from the beginning? Tatum, meanwhile, has spent his airtime pushing in the opposite direction. He has questioned the authenticity of circulating audio, discussed what he describes as news sources connected to the timeline, and repeatedly urged his audience not to convict a group of teenagers in the court of public opinion before there is any formal evidence against them. Taken individually, both of those instincts are understandable. Wanting urgency for a grieving mother is not a character flaw. Wanting due process for teenagers who have not been charged is not a character flaw either. The real problem, and this is something almost nobody covering their dispute this week has said directly, is that once two commentators with large platforms begin treating each other as the opposing side, the case underneath them gradually becomes smaller in the frame. Ratings and engagement can start doing the work that investigators are supposed to be doing instead. There's another important detail worth pointing out because it changes how you should understand everything that follows. Neither Grace nor Tatum is simply observing this case from the sidelines in the same way a wire service reporter might. Grace spent years working as a felony prosecutor before she ever became a television host. That background means she tends to approach a case the way someone preparing for an indictment might, looking for the gaps that a defense attorney could later exploit and attempting to address those weaknesses publicly first. Tatum spent years wearing a police badge. That background means he approaches a case more like an officer examining a scene report, looking for procedural shortcuts that could undermine an investigation or allow an inaccurate narrative to become established before all the facts are known. Those are not neutral professional backgrounds. They are two different perspectives shaped by two very different careers, and both are now being applied to the death of the same 18-year-old from opposite institutional instincts. That's important to understand before deciding which one sounds more convincing to you, because a courtroom-oriented perspective and a patrol-oriented perspective can interpret the exact same ambiguous fact in completely different ways almost every time. So let's be precise about what actually happened this week, because headlines claiming that Nancy Grace destroyed Officer Tatum or that Officer Tatum stunned Nancy Grace have both been circulating. Sometimes those headlines are describing the very same exchange, depending on which channel's algorithm happens to put the story in front of you first. According to reporting that circulated alongside clips from both programs, Tatum appeared on Nancy Grace's show this week, and the two directly disagreed over a claim that had been circulating through social media and podcast circles for several days. The claim involved whether some or all of the friends who were with Nolan on Horn Island had taken, or had agreed to take, a polygraph examination. Grace pressed for clarification over whether that had actually happened and, if so, what form the examination had taken. Tatum, according to the same reporting, challenged the way the claim was being framed. The two went back and forth over what kind of examination, if any, had actually occurred and who had verified it. We want to be extremely careful here, because this is exactly the kind of moment that can be reduced to a 5-word headline while everything that made the situation complicated gets stripped away. Lie detector test is one of those phrases that immediately sounds like solid evidence when you hear it, even though it rarely is. We're going to spend some real time examining that specific phrase in a few minutes because it deserves much more than a passing mention. For now, keep this in mind. Even in the best case scenario, even if every detail surrounding a polygraph in this case eventually turns out to be completely accurate, it still would not, by itself, tell us what happened to Nolan Wells on that island. That's not a reason to dismiss the story. It's a reason to slow down before repeating it as established fact. Before we go deeper into what actually happened between these two commentators and what Nolan's friends did in response, we need you to do something for us. This case is moving quickly, and depending on when you're watching this, there could already be a new development that we haven't covered yet. So drop the word horizon in the comments right now. That's our signal. When you comment horizon, it tells us you're watching in real time and want the next update as soon as it drops, before the algorithm even catches up. We read every single horizon comment, and it genuinely helps us decide what to cover next. Skip this part, and you could miss the follow-up entirely, because we're not going to fill this channel with recycled titles. We're going to focus on the people who have told us they're actually here for the updates. Type horizon now, and let's keep going. And look, we've noticed something in our own numbers recently that we want to be honest with you about. More of you are watching these videos, but many of you still haven't subscribed to the channel. That gap matters more than you might think. It's genuinely the difference between being able to continue following a case like this all the way to its conclusion and potentially losing the thread halfway through because the channel doesn't have the audience support needed for the amount of time this coverage takes. So if you've made it this far and you're still not subscribed, take 3 seconds and fix that right now. It costs you nothing, and it's one of the reasons we're still here bringing you the parts of this story that other channels may be skipping. Now let's actually do what almost nobody covering this dispute has bothered to do this week. Let's break down the word polygraph and examine what it can and cannot actually tell you, because that single word is carrying an enormous amount of weight in this case right now, and most of the people repeating it don't seem to understand what it is actually based on.
Guys, let me first introduce Cheryl McCollum, Cold Case Investigative Research Institute founder. Let that sink in at coldcasecrimes.org. She's a star of a hit podcast that I have listened to on loop, by the way, Cheryl McCollum. And I don't like much of what you're saying, yet I keep listening. Zone 7, she's author of a brand new book, Swans Don't Swim in a Sewer, solving the cold case of the Flint River Killer's daughter, and more. But for my purposes tonight, she's a forensics expert. Greg Morse. Before I even get to the merits of this, where I meant to go with this is everyone has been focusing on the young men that were on the boat that took him to Horn Island. Then we get this audio that we're trying to corroborate, where seemingly in the background you hear them talking about trying to revive Nolan Wells on the boat. Is that even real? We don't know yet. Or has it been doctored? Trying to find out. I've got experts telling me, renowned experts, by the way, it's real, and renowned experts saying it's not real. It's just like a trial, right? Where it's expert v. expert, who's telling the truth.
Sure.
I wanted to talk about this mystery altercation. If it happened at 5 p.m., that boat was already gone. Now,
Well,
as
you're
much
right.
as some people want to hang the young guys on the boat, I want to make sure we hang the right person. If there is a mystery altercation after that boat lift, we need to be investigating that altercation.
Well, you're 100% right, because the 3 young men that are, at least the people are saying are involved in this, that went there with Nolan Wells, there's a specific timeline
Put
from
him
what
up.
I read
Put him
They
up.
needed assistance on their boat. They left at 4:30.
You
They had
just
called
gave me
CTO.
a chill
So
down my spine.
if
You
so,
can't
if there
introduce
is
something because people say, I don't care what people say on either side.
No,
They mean nothing to me. What?
Nancy, that's the problem when we have things like podcasts today and people who are not qualified to talk about serious things like this. They're not experts. They want to get likes. Law enforcement is going to keep information
He
close to the
said
best.
he saw the DMs. I don't have
Okay,
a
so what does that
reason
mean?
to think
That's
he
not
didn't
legitimate.
see the DMs. Now,
The-
many people are arguing that he has taken a side. We have not taken a side. I'm on the side of finding out why everybody got back to the mainland except Nolan Wells.
Well,
And
listen,
nobody
these
saw
are
anything.
teenagers.
Nobody knows anything. It's just like Tupac Shakur got shot on the Strip
Nancy,
at Vegas, and we still don't know what happened. Nobody saw a thing. That's BS.
These are
What?
young men hanging out. It's not unusual one may stay behind to hang out with other people. None of that is unusual for teenagers partying and having a good time. So that fact alone doesn't
Morse.
mean anything. What?
Where's your cell phone? Where is
The-
your cell phone? And try not to lie. Where's your cell phone?
Okay. Right here.
Oh, really? Because here's mine. So you want to tell me Nolan Wells stayed behind and his cell phone went without him? I understand. Don't everybody start screaming that he didn't want to get it wet. Of course he didn't want to get it wet. But there's ways around that. You can go put it on shore in your shoe like everybody else does to hide it from people and then retrieve it when you go. But no, he let the boat leave with his phone. I agree with his mother on that. That is not Nolan Wells. He was never away from his phone.
So that doesn't mean anything in and of itself with what's coming out about this. You're talking about him staying behind. You're talking about there's evidence that he was there after 4:30 p.m. If he's there after 4:30 p.m., Nolan Wells, on that island hanging out with other people, that's it. The fact that a cell phone is on a boat and he's not as a teenager doesn't really mean anything at all.
Okay, you know what? I asked you about a mystery altercation, and should we be looking in that direction right now? And you're like going on and on about the cell phone.
No, but
everybody
that's
that
my
owns
point.
a cell phone, which is everyone,
but
knows you never
Nancy,
leave
that's
without
my
your cell
point.
phone.
You have to look at what really happened. If there was this mystery altercation, then yes, the police need to be investigating that. They need to be looking into that.
A polygraph measures physiological reactions such as heart rate, blood pressure, respiration, and skin conductivity. What it does not measure is truth itself. It measures stress and other physical responses. Stress can certainly accompany deception, but it can also come from fear, anxiety, or simply being an 18-year-old sitting in a room and answering questions about the worst day of your life while sensors are attached to your body and while an unfamiliar officer or legal professional watches your reactions. That distinction is important in the Nolan Wells case. Polygraph results are generally not admissible as courtroom evidence in the overwhelming majority of American jurisdictions, including Mississippi. That isn't necessarily because the machine itself is fake. The issue is whether the science used to interpret those physiological reactions is reliable enough to meet the standard courts require before accepting something as proof. So what would a polygraph actually mean here? Hypothetically, if one or more of Nolan's friends took a polygraph and the results supposedly indicated deception on a particular question, that would not automatically give a prosecutor evidence they could bring into a Mississippi courtroom to prove someone committed a crime. At most, it could become one small part of an investigator's internal process, perhaps giving investigators a reason to examine a particular answer or lead more closely. And the reverse is true as well. If someone received a result suggesting they were truthful, that would not automatically clear them. The test isn't designed to carry the weight both sides of this online argument are placing on it. So why has one word, polygraph, dominated so much of the discussion between two major commentators? Because lie detector is one of the most emotionally powerful phrases in true crime. It sounds conclusive and scientific, looks perfect in a thumbnail, and can make an audience feel closer to an answer even when none has been established. This isn't specifically a criticism of Nancy Grace or Officer Tatum. It's a criticism of a broader tendency in true crime coverage, including ours, to choose dramatic wording over precise wording. Dramatic language attracts attention and views. There's another point we need to make clear. We do not have independent primary confirmation of exactly who took a polygraph, who administered it, what questions were asked, or what the results showed, assuming any results exist. What we have are competing media accounts of a claim filtered through captions, clips, and headlines. That is exactly the kind of situation this channel should slow down rather than accelerate before repeating it. So instead of declaring a winner in the Grace Tatum exchange, the better question is, what evidence would actually settle the dispute? We would need a named polygraph examiner willing to put their credentials on the record, a specific examination date, the exact questions asked, and documented results released through an attorney or official statement. Until that level of detail becomes available, polygraph remains a disputed word between two media platforms, not an established fact within the investigation itself. Now the story shifts from the disputed polygraph claim to the young people who were with Nolan on Horn Island. For most of July, Nolan's friends stayed away from the spotlight, apart from a few interviews. One of the most notable came from Track Shepard, who spoke with multiple outlets to correct the records surrounding a viral video. That recording had been widely interpreted as showing Nolan involved in an argument over his phone. Even attorney Ben Crump had, at one point, believed the footage showed Nolan. Shepard has publicly stated more than once that the voice heard in the recording is actually his own and that the incident came from a completely separate confrontation. That distinction matters. For weeks, the clip was treated online as nearly confirmed evidence of a confrontation involving Nolan. According to Shepard's account, however, it was him in a different dispute, where friends physically restrained him. We covered that issue previously because the original claim traveled much farther and faster than the correction ever did. And that brings us to the development that changed the conversation this week. According to reporting and social media coverage, Nolan's friends have launched a fundraising campaign after spending weeks dealing with what multiple family members have described as death threats. The campaign is presented as an effort to defend themselves against what they say are false narratives spreading online. It is important to be clear about what that fundraiser does not prove. It is not a confession. It is not an admission that something happened aboard the boat beyond what has already been publicly reported. And it does not establish guilt or innocence. Someone who is innocent can raise money for legal representation or protection. Someone facing serious accusations could do the same thing. The fundraiser alone cannot answer what happened to Nolan. What it does show is that these teenagers say they are being targeted because of viral claims about them, including claims that have already been challenged or debunked. Their response appears to be an attempt to deal with that pressure through legal channels rather than simply remaining silent. This connects directly to the growing disagreement between Nancy Grace and Officer Tatum. According to coverage circulating this week, part of the renewed friction between them involved the fundraiser and a broader question. Should the friends' public response be viewed as a legitimate attempt to fight misinformation, or as a public relations strategy by people who have something to hide? Tatum has reportedly leaned toward the first interpretation. Grace has continued pressing the questions she has raised from the beginning, including Nolan's phone, the deleted Snapchat activity, and the timeline after 4:31 p.m. We are not going to tell you which interpretation is correct, because neither we nor the people reading these headlines were in that room. What we can say is that a fundraiser built around fighting harassment demonstrates that harassment is being alleged and discussed publicly. It does not, by itself, resolve the unanswered questions surrounding Nolan's death. There is another important point in the mechanics of a fundraising campaign that deserves attention, because much coverage has moved past it without explaining what the money is for. Crowdfunding a legal defense fund is not the same as raising money for bail, restitution, or anything connected to an active criminal proceeding, because there is no criminal case against these teenagers at this point. In situations like this, the money can potentially go toward legal retainers, defamation attorneys, security consultations for families facing credible threats, and even ordinary living expenses when a teenager's name and image are repeatedly circulated alongside accusations they have never had an opportunity to formally answer in court. That is a different financial need from the kind of fundraiser true crime audiences may automatically become suspicious of. Treating every legal defense fundraiser as evidence of guilt misses the purpose behind the request and can turn a complicated situation into another source of speculation. There is also a broader issue connecting the fundraiser directly to the dispute between Nancy Grace and Officer Tatum. According to reporting that circulated this week, disagreement over the friend's response helped fuel renewed tension between the two commentators. The question is whether the friend's pushback should be understood as a legitimate response to misinformation or as a public relations strategy from people who have something to conceal. Those are very different interpretations. Tatum has reportedly leaned toward the first, while Grace has continued emphasizing the unanswered questions she has raised from the beginning, including Nolan's phone, the deleted Snapchat activity, and the timeline after 4:31 p.m. But there is something neither interpretation can establish on its own. A fundraiser cannot tell us what happened on Horn Island. It cannot prove innocence and it cannot prove guilt. It simply shows that the people involved say they are facing enough pressure to seek financial and legal support. Multiple people connected to the case have also described harassment directed at individuals who have not been charged with anything. That includes reports of an anonymous call demanding an investigation into Nolan's mother because of her work as a healthcare provider and someone's decision to treat that occupation as suspicious. Whatever someone believes about this case, there is an important line that should not be crossed. Demanding answers about an 18-year-old's death is not the same as having the right to threaten the people who knew him. Before we continue, we want you to remember one word: ledger. That is what we're building throughout this series, a running record of what is confirmed and what remains noise, case by case and video by video. The goal is to follow this story until its conclusion without allowing rumors to replace facts. If you've stayed with us this long, you already understand what this channel is trying to do. So if you haven't subscribed yet, take a moment and make it official. Every subscriber helps us continue following cases like Nolan's carefully, rather than simply chasing whichever development gets the most attention. Before we move forward, there is another claim that has been circulating aggressively over the past several days, and it needs to be handled carefully. If you've spent time in the comments of other channels covering this case, you've probably already seen some version of it. Multiple posts, particularly on TikTok and Threads, have claimed that Officer Tatum publicly apologized to Christine Wansley, Nolan's mother, after supposedly being caught lying about the friend's polygraph situation. We are not going to repeat that claim as fact, because there is an important difference between something spreading widely online and something being independently confirmed. What can we verify is that Nancy Grace and Officer Tatum are involved in an ongoing public disagreement over claims surrounding a possible polygraph examination connected to Nolan's friends. That disagreement has appeared across material associated with both sides, making the existence of the dispute itself reasonably clear. What we cannot independently establish from the available sourcing is the specific claim that Tatum issued a formal apology to Christine Wansley. That particular story appears to be moving primarily through second-hand social media posts, many of which use dramatic wording directly in their captions. Those captions can make it sound as though the viewer already knows exactly what happened before ever seeing the original footage. That does not automatically mean the apology claim is false. It means we have not been able to independently confirm it. And that distinction matters because this is precisely how misinformation can build inside a case. A claim begins somewhere, receives an attention-grabbing caption, gets shared repeatedly, and eventually becomes familiar enough that people stop questioning where it originated. We saw a similar pattern with the viral pool party photograph and the misidentified argument audio discussed in our earlier coverage. The original versions traveled quickly, while corrections struggled to catch up. Once thousands of people have already seen a dramatic claim, even a later correction may never reach the same audience. We don't want to add another unverified statement to that pile, even when the claim involves a commentator rather than Nolan's friends or family. There is a name for the broader pattern, the confirmation cascade. Imagine a small account posts a claim. A larger account reposts it with a more dramatic caption because dramatic wording generates more engagement. Then an even larger account shares that repost, treating it almost like a primary source. By the fourth or fifth repetition, the original context can disappear completely. Eventually, People begin repeating the claim beneath legitimate news coverage because they remember seeing it somewhere that looked reliable. The strange part is that nobody in that chain necessarily had to deliberately lie. Many people may genuinely believe the information they are sharing. But repeating a claim does not make the underlying evidence stronger. It only makes the claim more familiar. And online, familiarity can easily be mistaken for verification. That is why every major development in the Nolan Wells case needs to be separated into what is confirmed, what is disputed, and what remains unknown. Before we move into the forensic side of this case, there is one more thing we want from you. Comment the word anchor below. Anchor. Because an anchor keeps you steady when everything around you is moving quickly. And that is exactly what we are trying to provide in a case that has produced more twists in 6 weeks than many cold cases produce in 6 years. When you comment anchor, you are telling us that you want to stay grounded with us through whatever comes next, rather than being pulled toward whichever clip happens to go viral first. So type anchor before you continue watching, and let's keep moving through this case carefully. And we want to be straightforward with you one more time, because you have stayed with us this far and you deserve the honest version. This channel grows because viewers like you choose to stay, not because an algorithm simply decides to give us a favor. More people are watching these videos, but many still have not subscribed. That gap matters. It affects whether we can continue following every development in the Nolan Wells case with the attention it truly fully deserves. If you have made it this far, then you are clearly the kind of viewer this channel was built for. So do us a favor and make it official. Hit the subscribe button before moving into the next section, so you do not miss what comes next. Now we need to turn to the part of this case that has produced some of the most confident-sounding claims from people who may not actually be qualified to interpret them. We are talking about the autopsy. More specifically, we are talking about a public disagreement that surfaced weeks ago during a separate broadcast between a forensic investigator and a professor specializing in death investigations. That disagreement continues to influence how people discuss Nolan's case today, even though many viewers who watched those exchanges may not have understood what the two sides were actually debating. This is important because forensic evidence can sound definitive when it is presented in a headline or a short clip. Terms involving an autopsy, physical findings, or cause and manner of death can immediately make a discussion feel settled, even when specialists are still interpreting the same evidence differently. That is why we are going to slow this part down. Before accepting anyone's conclusion about Nolan's autopsy, it is worth separating what the examination actually established from what commentators believe those findings might mean. The distinction may seem small, but in a case surrounded by competing narratives, it can change the entire conversation. The disagreement between the forensic investigator and the death investigation professor deserves that same level of care. Rather than choosing a side because one explanation sounds more convincing, we need to understand what was actually said, what evidence was being discussed, and where the experts genuinely agreed or disagreed. That is where the forensic portion of this case begins.
You know what? Let's hear Tatum again. And hey, take it for what it's worth. Try to get the truth out of what we're hearing. Okay? Listen.
Nolan and another person that he may have been in an argument with, to me, are people that need to be investigated.
With that, I agree with Tatum. As much as we disagree on practically everything else, if this happened, and forget about the girl, I'm talking about the altercation. Cheryl McCollum, come on. He dies. Nobody sees him. The others get back safely. Now we're hearing about an altercation afterwards. And I'm not ruling out that he was on that boat when they left. But now I'm hearing about an altercation. When you can't tell the truth of what's happening, look at who was angry. Look if there was an altercation. I don't know what happened, but when I hear altercation after the Triton left, I've got to go there.
You got to look at it. You absolutely cannot ignore it. But one thing we already know from the second autopsy, they would have mentioned if he had any type of injury to his knuckles, if he had been in a fight. We didn't hear anything about abrasions or bruising or any type of injury that would be indicative of somebody that is
What?
a
What?
college
What?
football player
Whoa, whoa,
fighting
whoa.
somebody.
Okay, now I have just told everybody that you're a forensic expert. It's starting to taste like a dirt sandwich. Because, okay, I'm going to let you sit in the corner and think about what you just said. Joe Scott Morgan is joining me, professor of forensics, Jacksonville State University, author of Blood Beneath My Feet on Amazon, star of a hit series, Body Bags with Joseph Scott Morgan. He is a death investigator with over 10,000 death scenes under his belt, deaths of all genre. Joe Scott Morgan, let's refresh Cheryl McCollum's recollection. That's what you say in court when obviously the witness is gone off the rails. Your Honor, pause, Your Honor, objection. May I refresh the witness's recollection? In other words, get it together. Don't you remember what we just talked about before you got on the stand, and you give them a piece of paper and go, can we see that the drawings on the autopsy control room? Joe Scott, there's a big, thank you. There's a big honking mark, subcutaneous, deep reddening tissue on his occipital. If I hit somebody in the back of the head, it'd be right there. We don't know what that is.
No, we don't. But to Cheryl's point, she's accurate. And here's why. Because in forensics, it's not just about positive findings. It's also about negative findings, those things that we are absent. So in that report, as she had mentioned, there was no indication that there was any kind of contusions on the hand, the arm, no kind of defensive event like a parry with a forearm, scuffing of the knuckles, that sort of thing. This forensic pathologist that did the second assessment didn't see any evidence of that. And so that's the first place I'm going to go to, aside from not having the actual primary autopsy report that has not been released yet. But you've got an individual that has, in fact, been retained by the family that's making this assessment. And it's a pretty damn thorough assessment, as a matter of fact, based upon many of them that I've read over the years. You don't see any kind of insults to the arms, the hands, anything like this. The one thing about that thing in the back, this focal area that they're talking about is, and I come back to this all the time, Nancy, is that his body, Nolan's body, is in such a state of decomposition to this point that he cannot make a definitive assessment on that area. And he did a multi-layered dissection, which, by the way, according to him, had not been done by the state medical examiner's office in Mississippi. He just went about it a different way. And as a matter of fact, if you like that one, I got another one. The examination that this physician in DC did on Nolan's remains ranks right up there with the most thorough, hear me talking, the most thorough dissection that you can possibly do on human remains. It's the same one that we do on bodies that have died, individuals that have died that have been incarcerated, in custody deaths. You know what all that means: in the back of a cruiser, in a holding cell, in a prison. Those autopsies rank right up there with the most thorough that we can go. It's a very deep dive that they did on his body.
Joe Scott, you are stating that due to the level of decomposition in Nolan Wells' body, that you can't really figure out why his occipital bone area had deep reddening, and that was seen nowhere else in the body. That's because of decomposition. Isn't that true?
Well, it's true in the sense that that's what
Didn't
the
you just say that?
I'm repeating what the physician said in his autopsy report. I didn't do the examination.
So then that would be a yes. So at that level of decomp that you're claiming could obscure the nature of the deep reddening on his occipital area, but yet on the other side of your mouth, you're claiming that even with this intense decomposition, you didn't see evidence of any reddening on his knuckles or any indication of a fight. So you want it two ways. You want to say decomp, can't tell what that was on the back of his head, but even though he's highly decomposed, I can tell you, he didn't have any reddening on his knuckles. Really?
No.
Because I
Do you
see
know-
a problem with that.
Okay, you've skinned your knee before, right? Okay. If you have an abrasion, that's completely different than a contusion. That means you have scraping and the tearing away of the skin. That's something that's very obvious. And guess what? I've been in enough fist fights in my life that I know
reddening.
what scraping. Right, I know, and you're misstating that because it's not a matter of reddening. When we look at hands, we also look at contact points where people are being abraded as a result of scuffing their hands. That's different than a color discoloration. We're talking about the top layer, the epidermis down to the dermis, is being scraped away. He doesn't see any evidence of that in his
I'm not
autopsy
talking
report.
about a scrape. I'm talking about if he had, for instance, reddening from a welt, the beginnings of a bruise. With that level of decomp, you're telling me you could still make that out?
No, those two things cannot exist in the same universe. You have to have an abraded area, and there would be multiple of them on his hands if he is punching or trying to defend himself. And yes, we can make out bruises. Yeah, we can make out bruises.
You
and
don't always have to have
decomposing
scrapes on
body.
your hand when you throw a punch. You don't always have to have cuts on your hand when you throw a punch. That's not true.
Well, that sounds mighty convenient if that's the road you want to go down, because I've seen them many times.
That's what I'm telling you. What you're saying is mighty darn convenient. That the reddening on the back of his head, can't really tell anything because he's so decomposed, but you can see his hands well enough to know he was not in a fist fight. Yeah,
Right.
that's convenient, Joe Scott.
he
Look,
was not in
I'm
a
not
fist
trying
fight.
to convict anybody. I'm trying to find the truth. I'm
Mm-hmm.
trying to find out if this evidence of an altercation really happened. And to further muddy the waters, now we have more witnesses stating what they saw.
Here is the simplest way to understand the forensic dispute surrounding Nolan Wells. A second, independent autopsy was performed in Washington, D.C., separate from the examination conducted by the state of Mississippi. According to the account presented in this case, that examination reportedly identified an area of deep redness in the tissue near the back of Nolan's head. That single finding has generated significant speculation. Some people have suggested that a mark like this could potentially be consistent with blunt force trauma, but that is only one possible interpretation. Similar discoloration can also occur through nonviolent processes, particularly after a body has spent time in water and decomposition has begun. That is where the disagreement between two forensic professionals becomes important. Their different interpretations actually demonstrate how complicated it can be to evaluate soft tissue findings after decomposition has progressed. One expert argued that the condition of Nolan's remains at the time of examination made it difficult to determine confidently what the discoloration near the back of his head represented. At the same time, that expert pointed to another finding. The examination reportedly did not identify abrasions, scraping, or defensive injuries on Nolan's hands. Those are the kinds of injuries investigators might look for when considering whether someone was involved in a physical struggle. A second expert challenged that reasoning. The concern was about treating different findings from the same decomposed body as though they had completely different levels of reliability. In other words, if decomposition makes one area too difficult to interpret with confidence, the question becomes why another area of that same body could automatically be considered reliable enough to rule something out. We need to be careful here. We are not forensic pathologists, and neither is the average person repeating confident conclusions about this mark on social media. What can be said from the material presented is that both experts were making arguments about a genuinely difficult forensic issue. Decomposition can complicate the interpretation of soft tissue changes. A body that has spent time in warm Gulf water can undergo changes that make bruising, discoloration, and certain forms of trauma more difficult to distinguish from normal postmortem processes. That is a basic challenge in forensic pathology, and it is one reason specialists can be cautious when interpreting decomposed remains. This is also why the complete written autopsy report matters far more than a brief description delivered during a television discussion. The report, along with any pending toxicology findings, should provide the formal medical conclusions that eventually carry greater weight. For now, The unexplained mark should remain exactly that, an unresolved forensic finding. Its presence does not automatically prove trauma, and its absence would not automatically prove that no confrontation occurred. Until the complete findings are publicly available, confident claims in either direction go beyond what this detail alone can establish. The responsible approach is to wait for documented conclusions, examine the evidence in context, and avoid turning one uncertain observation into a final explanation for Nolan's death by everyone involved. The forensic debate is only one piece of the puzzle. Another major question comes from the timeline of what happened on Horn Island, because unlike personal recollections, some of the movement that day is supported by tracking data. According to GPS information obtained by CBS News from the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources, the boat carrying Nolan and his friends left a private dock at approximately 9:56 that morning. It reached Horn Island a little over an hour later, around 11:14 a.m. The boat then departed the island at approximately 4:31 p.m., but Nolan was not aboard when it left. Those times are important because they create a specific window that remains at the center of the unanswered questions. Attorney Ben Crump has publicly stated that Nolan was last seen on the island at around 3 p.m. If that account is accurate, there were roughly 90 minutes between Nolan's last reported sighting and the boat's departure at 4:31 p.m. 90 minutes may not sound enormous, but on a busy holiday island, it is still enough time for a conversation, a disagreement, a change of plans, or people becoming separated. It is also the period surrounding the mechanical problem reportedly affecting the boat and contributing to what has been described as an early and chaotic departure. That gap is therefore important because the accounts surrounding it do not completely answer what happened during those final 90 minutes. Then there is Nolan's phone. According to multiple reports, his phone remained on the boat when the group left the island. His family later tracked the device through the Life 360 application, with the location indicating that the phone had returned to the mainland even though Nolan had not. His mother has also said that when she and another family member reviewed the phone, they discovered that 2 Snapchat accounts had been wiped of saved photos and videos from that day. That detail has attracted substantial attention because Nolan was reportedly someone who regularly documented his activities on his phone. There is, however, another explanation that has been offered. One of Nolan's friends reportedly told an outlet that leaving phones aboard the boat before swimming was normal for the group. The purpose was apparently to keep the devices away from salt water. Nolan's phone was reportedly among more than a dozen phones left on the dashboard. That explanation is certainly possible. People routinely leave phones behind when entering the water. But it does not automatically explain the deleted Snapchat material. A phone sitting untouched on a boat does not, by itself, establish why saved content disappeared. Determining whether the deletion happened before the trip through an automatic setting or application issue, or after Nolan became separated from the device requires a proper digital forensic examination. Until that examination produces documented findings, the wiped Snapchat accounts remain an important unanswered question, not proof of what happened, but a detail investigators may eventually be able to explain. There is another important tension in these details. A 90-minute gap, a phone left on a boat, and wiped Snapchat content can each have ordinary explanations. A teenager may leave a phone behind simply to protect it from salt water. An application can behave unexpectedly. Different witnesses can remember the same chaotic afternoon differently, especially when they are young and trying to describe an extremely difficult event weeks later. None of those possibilities automatically points to something sinister. At the same time, unresolved questions can become increasingly difficult for a family to accept as time passes. What might look like several ordinary details when examined separately can feel very different when they remain unexplained together for more than a month. That does not turn those details into proof. It simply explains why Nolan's family continues to seek clearer answers. That is the larger thread connecting almost everything surrounding this case. The timeline, the phone, the Snapchat activity, the forensic questions, and the conflicting public accounts. Each issue is separate, but they intersect around the same central question. What happened to Nolan after he was last seen and before the boat left Horn Island? That question should remain at the center, even when the online conversation shifts toward louder arguments between commentators. There is also another discussion surrounding Nolan's case that deserves careful treatment: race. A significant part of the public reaction has focused on the fact that Nolan was reportedly one of the few black teenagers, or possibly the only black teenager, within the larger group on Horn Island that day. Some members of the public and commentators have argued that this detail may be relevant when considering the circumstances surrounding the case and the initial response from authorities. Those concerns have sometimes been connected to broader historical patterns in American criminal justice, where cases involving black victims have been criticized for receiving less attention or moving differently than comparable cases involving white victims. But there is another perspective as well. Some of Nolan's friends and others discussing the case have pushed back against treating the racial makeup of the group as inherently suspicious. Their argument is that race, by itself, cannot establish that anyone involved did something wrong, especially when no one from the group has been charged with a crime. Both concerns can exist at the same time. It is reasonable to acknowledge documented historical concerns about unequal treatment while also insisting that an uncharged teenager's race should never be treated as evidence of wrongdoing. This channel cannot settle that larger debate through one video, and neither should anyone pretend that it can. The responsible approach is to examine specific evidence, separate documented facts from assumptions, and allow investigators to establish what the available evidence actually shows. That may be uncomfortable, but it is far more honest than forcing a conclusion before the evidence is complete.
Another report came to me of someone saying that they saw Nolan with a girl, and they believed that they saw Nolan and this girl struggling in the water. Not necessarily drowning, but struggling. Like it was obvious enough that the person was concerned when they saw Nolan in the water, and he was with this girl.
You know, that's from Officer Tatum's show. Cheryl McCollum, it seems to me that that's not true. Because don't you think if a witness saw one or two people, quote, struggling in the water, I mean, I would try to help them.
It makes no sense.
And they did nothing?
It doesn't make any sense. That wouldn't be their focal, that they would pay attention to those two people that are struggling to see, is one going under and not resurfacing? What can we do to help? The idea that they would watch that, see a struggle, and then what? Turn back and finish barbecuing? That doesn't make any sense to me at all.
Not at all. So this is a problem, Greg Morse. You're a veteran trial lawyer. We're getting so much information, and a lot of it is inconsistent. And that is why you have cross-examination. So you can test the evidence. Test whether it's true under the fire of cross-exam. When you have conflicting stories like this, my instinct is to go with the one that makes the most sense. What do you make of these claims that Nolan was struggling in the water? I really believe if he had been, quote, struggling in the water, that either she or her friends would have come forward by now. I mean, what about these guys on the boat that had already left? Don't they want to save them? I mean, well, I'm just trying to find out what happened to Nolan. And if this is true, it may place him on the island after they left.
Well, that's it, and that's what the police are doing, is they're going to run these leads down, and they're going to try to verify what's credible and what's not before they go to a grand jury. They're going to exclude information that they think is completely uncredible. However, all of this information, if people are arrested at some point in the future and charged with a crime for Nolan Wells' death, then all of these conflicting stories, all of these different timelines, they become a conflict in the evidence. And as you know, Nancy, there's 3 ways a jury can find reasonable doubt if this ever gets there. And one of those ways is in a conflict in the evidence. So these are all favorable things that would benefit a defendant or defendants down the road. However, there's a reason why law enforcement does investigations. Professionals do it, not podcasters talking about it. Verified sources, all of that is nonsense. The police are going to keep information to themselves. They're going to also keep information private so they can test statements that come from people and verify what they're saying based on factors that don't get released in the media. So clearly something happened after 4:30 when the Triton boat apparently left. And all of these things the police will find, they will discover. The police can discover whose phones were active at the time in that whole area if they choose. May not be able to use it in court anymore after the recent Supreme Court decision a few weeks ago on cell site location information. However, it's an investigative tool that they can line up who's there. They can also line these things up by the boats. Right. And they're calling CETO and things like that. So these are all things the police are going to verify and shake out what they believe led to this young man's death.
I can get the GPS, Morse. I can get the GPS. Yep. I can get the cell phone data. I can get the tracking data. I can tell exactly what time the boat left. But I can tell the truth of that. But I can't tell the truth right now about these conflicting reports. Was he on the boat? His phone was on the boat. That's the whole point. He's traveling with his phone, then he's on the boat. They're saying, no, he wasn't on the boat. Now this altercation has arisen, evidence of that emerging after the boat left. Who's telling the truth? His mom says, no way would he have let the boat leave without his phone. Okay, that said, the mom is getting death threats. Nolan Wells' mother dealing with not only her son is gone, he's dead. The investigation going on. Now she's getting threats. Isn't it true, Susan Hendricks joining us, investigative journalist, author of Down the Hill, My Descent into the Double Murder in Delphi, that someone actually called for an investigation into Nolan Wells' mother? Isn't she a home health care nurse?
She is, and it was an anonymous call saying that she needed to be investigated. To me, it was outright backlash connected to what happened to her son. It's despicable considering everything she's already going through. Anonymous calls to say that she's not up to par and needs to be investigated. It's sickening.
There is one more piece of this conversation worth slowing down for, because it connects directly to the way the Nolan Wells case has been discussed in public. The question of race. When Reverend Al Sharpton appeared alongside Nolan's parents and attorney Ben Crump, the message was more measured than some of the loudest commentary surrounding the case. The family was calling for transparency, urgency, and a thorough investigation. At the same time, the possibility that race could be relevant was not something they wanted dismissed automatically. That distinction matters. Looking at whether race affected attention, response, or treatment is different from declaring that race proves what happened to Nolan. Those are two separate questions, and separating them is important. A historical pattern can justify asking whether similar cases have received different levels of attention or urgency. But the race of the people involved cannot, by itself, establish guilt, innocence, intent, or what happened on Horn Island. The same principle has to apply to everyone connected to this investigation. Asking hard questions is fair. Turning an unanswered question into a conclusion is something else entirely. And that brings us back to a pattern that has appeared repeatedly throughout the Nolan Wells story. A photograph surfaces. An audio clip appears. Someone attaches a dramatic explanation to it. The claim spreads across social media, gets repeated by larger accounts, and suddenly starts sounding like established evidence. Only later does somebody stop and check where the material actually came from. The pool party photo is a clear example. The image circulated with suggestions that it might have shown Nolan after the Horn Island incident. But later reporting indicated that the photograph was taken in June, before the July 4th trip. That correction changed what the picture could reasonably tell anyone about Nolan's final days. The same problem appeared with the viral argument audio. Attorney Ben Crump had circulated the recording as potentially showing Nolan involved in a confrontation. Trace's Tin Shepard later said publicly that the voice was his, describing a separate incident rather than Nolan being involved. That clarification matters because an audio clip can sound convincing while still being attached to the wrong person or the wrong moment. Then there was the claim involving a supposed witness who had seen people struggling in the water. A statement like that sounds enormous when reduced to a headline, but it still has to survive questions about who witnessed it, when, where, and what exactly was observed. A dramatic description is not automatically reliable evidence. Now the same cycle is happening around the polygraph story and the alleged apology involving Tatum. The disagreement itself is part of the conversation, but claims surrounding it should not be treated as confirmed simply because multiple social media accounts repeat them. Repetition creates familiarity, not verification. That may be the most important lesson here. A claim can move from one account to another until nobody remembers the original source. Each repost adds confidence without necessarily adding evidence. By the time a correction appears, the first version may already be everywhere. Nolan's family deserves answers that can withstand that process. The public deserves information that can be checked. And this case deserves something even more basic: a line between what is documented, what is disputed, and what remains unknown. High-profile true crime cases move at a speed that traditional investigations simply cannot match. A new detail appears in the morning, clips spread by afternoon, and by evening thousands of people may already have formed an opinion about what happened. The Nolan Wells case has followed that pattern closely. Every unanswered question creates demand for another update, another explanation, another piece of content. That demand is understandable. People want to know what happened to Nolan, and his family wants answers even more urgently. The problem begins when the pressure to produce something new starts competing with the responsibility to verify what is being reported. Investigators can spend days or weeks checking records, examining digital evidence, reviewing interviews, and waiting for forensic results. Social media does not work that way. A 30-second clip can reach millions before anyone has established whether the claim attached to it is accurate. That difference has placed Nolan's family in an unusually difficult position. They are grieving while watching their son's name appear repeatedly in headlines, thumbnails, posts, live streams, and arguments between commentators. Some coverage may be trying to help. Some may be asking legitimate questions. But even well-intentioned attention can become overwhelming when every new rumor arrives before the previous one has been settled. Christine Wansley has repeatedly emphasized something much simpler than the online arguments surrounding the case. She wants the truth about her son. Her grief is not a media storyline, and her demand for answers should not be confused with a demand for a predetermined conclusion. At Nolan's funeral, she spoke about his character, his kindness, and the impact he had on people around him. Public reporting has also documented the family's continued calls for transparency and a thorough investigation. That distinction matters because the louder the surrounding debate becomes, the easier it is for Nolan himself to disappear from the center of the story. The case can start becoming about which commentator won an argument, which clip received more views, or which theory generated the strongest reaction. Meanwhile, the actual questions remain the same. What happened on Horn Island? Why did Nolan not return with his friends? And what evidence can ultimately explain the circumstances of his death? The same cycle can be seen in the broader coverage. A claim appears, a dramatic caption gives it emotional weight, larger accounts repeat it, and eventually repetition begins to look like confirmation. But repetition is not verification. The investigation moves according to evidence, while the internet moves according to attention. That is why this channel's goal should be to slow the process down rather than accelerate it. We can acknowledge uncertainty without pretending it means nothing. We can examine uncomfortable questions without declaring someone responsible before the evidence supports that conclusion. The family should not have to compete with the internet's appetite for drama while waiting for investigators to establish facts that can withstand scrutiny and independent review. So think of the word compass as a reminder for this case. When every new headline points in a different direction, the goal is not to follow the loudest one. It is to stay oriented toward the evidence, the unanswered questions, and the people still waiting for a real answer. Nolan's family deserves that kind of attention far more than another viral argument. Now we need to separate the public conversation from the legal process, because those are two very different tracks. In the Nolan Wells investigation, the question is no longer simply what people are saying online. It is what investigators can establish, what prosecutors can legally present, and what a grand jury may ultimately decide. One issue that has frustrated the family is access to the official incident report. During a July meeting with Jackson County District Attorney Angel Myers McElrath, the family's legal team said more than the expected period had passed without receiving the report and related information. Attorney Eric Hertz raised the 72-hour requirement during that discussion. But a delay in receiving information does not automatically prove investigators are hiding evidence or mishandling the case. Active investigations can involve information authorities do not want released prematurely, especially while witnesses are interviewed and evidence remains under examination. That brings us to the grand jury referral. District Attorney Angel Myers McElrath has said Nolan's case will be presented to a grand jury after the investigation is completed. She has also explained that Jackson County routinely presents qualifying death investigations to a grand jury and that the process is designed to protect the integrity of the investigation. A grand jury is not a trial jury. Its job is not to determine whether someone is guilty or innocent. Instead, it reviews evidence presented by prosecutors and determines whether there is enough probable cause to support an indictment. In Mississippi, 12 or more grand jurors must agree to return a true bill of indictment. Probable cause is also a much lower threshold than proof beyond a reasonable doubt. It generally means there is sufficient evidence to believe a crime occurred and that a particular person may have committed it. An indictment, therefore, does not mean the accused person has been proven guilty. It means the legal system has determined that the case can move forward toward trial. That distinction is important in a case surrounded by public pressure, because the legal system is designed to evaluate evidence rather than popularity, outrage, or the loudest theory circulating online. The proceedings themselves are confidential. Mississippi rules restrict who may be present and require secrecy around grand jury testimony, deliberations, and actions. That confidentiality exists partly to protect witnesses, the investigation, and people who could otherwise be publicly accused without ever being charged. That is why the ongoing public dispute between Nancy Grace and Officer Tatum has no formal authority over this process. Their arguments may influence public opinion, generate discussion, or encourage people to ask questions, but neither commentator gets to decide what evidence reaches the grand jury or whether an indictment is issued. The same applies to every viral clip, fundraiser, apology claim, or online theory. Public opinion operates on one track. The legal system operates on another. As of the latest reporting, the investigation remains active, the official autopsy findings have not been publicly released, and the grand jury review is expected after investigators complete their work. That may feel slow, especially to a grieving family. But the next meaningful development will not be whichever commentator wins the next argument. It will be whatever investigators can document, whatever prosecutors can present, and whatever evidence ultimately survives scrutiny. So, what actually happens next in the Nolan Wells case? That question matters because the online conversation has moved far ahead of the legal process. Viral clips can create the impression that a case is reaching a conclusion, but the official investigation still has its own sequence, and that sequence does not move according to social media. One major piece is the official autopsy. The state medical examiner has completed the examination, but the findings have not simply been released for public debate. Those results are part of the investigative record and are expected to be considered through the grand jury process. That means viewers should be careful with claims about what the official autopsy supposedly proves unless the underlying findings are formally made available. The family also has another important unanswered issue: Nolan's phone. His device has become central to the questions surrounding his final hours because it reportedly remained with the group after Nolan was separated from them. His family has questioned the absence of expected social media material, including Snapchat content, and has wanted the phone examined in a way that can preserve and independently evaluate its data. That digital examination matters because a phone can contain far more than a few visible messages or photographs. Investigators may be able to examine timestamps, application activity, account changes, deleted material, location information, and other technical records. But none of those possibilities should be treated as findings until qualified experts actually examine the device and document what they discover. The friends who were with Nolan also remain an important part of the unanswered timeline. Public interviews and statements are not the same thing as formal investigative interviews conducted under legal procedures. If investigators determine that additional questioning is necessary, those interviews could help establish what each person remembers, when they last saw Nolan, what happened during the boat's departure, and what occurred during the critical period afterward. There is another issue that cannot be ignored: harassment. Nolan's friends and family members have described intense public pressure, threats, and accusations. Whatever someone believes about the investigation, harassment does not establish guilt, innocence, or the truth of a disputed timeline. Those incidents are separate matters that law enforcement can address independently. Then there are the claims that have dominated online discussion: the alleged polygraph examinations and the reported apology involving Officer Tatum. Neither should be treated as established fact simply because a clip, headline, or social media post repeats it. What matters is whether those claims can be supported by identifiable on-record evidence. So, as this case moves forward, watch the evidence rather than the noise. Watch for the official findings, the digital examination, formal interviews, and any documented clarification of the disputed claims. And that distinction is especially important for Nolan's family. They are not waiting for a commentator to win an argument. They are waiting for investigators to establish a timeline, determine what the medical evidence shows, examine digital evidence, and explain how Nolan went from being with his friends to being found in the water. The central question has never changed. What happened to Nolan Wells after he was separated from his friends on Horn Island? Until that question is answered through evidence, every viral argument remains secondary. The investigation, not the internet, will ultimately determine what can be proven.